SpaceX is preparing to bring its massive Starship rocket to Florida's Space Coast, and it's made major progress on its new Gigabay facility, the launch mount and flame trench for Launch Complex 39A, as well as demolition to make way for future launch pads. At the same time, we're seeing Blue Origin prepare for the next several launches of another large rocket, New Glenn. Stoke and Relativity are also working hard at their own launch pads to bring those online, all while ULA gears up for Vulcan's first military launch. I'm Sawyer Rosenstein for NSF, and this is your Space Coast Update. As always, it won't just be me on this episode. Adrian and Ryan will be with me to bring you the latest happenings from the best coast. Let's begin at SpaceX's operations area at Roberts Road, where there has been quite a lot of activity since our last flyover. The most striking piece of activity is, of course, the new and massive Giga Bay building being built to the north. SpaceX has been working hard since the beginning of the year to build this large integration building for future Super Heavy boosters and Starship spacecraft. Even though it's been 3 months since we last flew over the Space Coast, teams are still just working on the foundations. In those 3 months, SpaceX has been drilling down the piles needed for the foundation using a continuous flight augering drill, often known as a CFA drill, which can still be seen hard at work as of this flyover. The CFA drills a hole deep into the ground, and as the auger is removed from the hole, concrete is poured in to fill it up. A rebar cage is later lowered into the freshly poured concrete to reinforce it, and then it's left to cure. Hundreds of these piles are then installed next to each other and topped off by a reinforced concrete cap. We can see that several of these piles have already been installed, and if you look closer, we can see the rebar sticking out from the ground. A lot of work still needs to be done to complete these foundations, including pouring the incredibly thick concrete layer that ties together the tops of all the piles. But the progress since April has been nothing short of impressive. Another advantage of these foundations being so far ahead into construction is that we can better see the layout of the Gigabay. While on the last flyover we had to guess where each of the things were going to go, this time it's a lot easier. The building will clearly feature 2 transfer aisles running down the length of it, with 6 working cells on each side. This will give SpaceX 24 different stations to build, integrate, and refurbish Starship vehicles in. One thing we'll continue to keep an eye out for is when clearing will start for the second phase of the Roberts Road Northern expansion. SpaceX only had approval so far to work on the first phase, and the Gigabay is located on a small portion of that area. The second phase is expected to be where SpaceX will build the Florida Star Factory, which will eventually grow to connect all the way to the Gigabay itself. At Roberts Road, teams are also putting together the Starship launch mount that will be used at Launch Complex 39A. Since our last flight, teams have made lots of progress integrating the water-cooled top deck onto the rest of the structure. It's hard to see the full work on this launch mount because, unlike the one SpaceX built at Starbase, this one is underneath a big old tent. This allows team to work on it while being protected from the regular afternoon storms here in Florida. If they need to lift a piece by crane, it turns out it's a rolling tent, so they can just roll the tent out of the way. Although most of the pieces for this top deck are installed, from this lower angle, it seems that one of them is still missing. Comparing the progress of this launch mount with the one for the second launch pad at Starbase, it appears that it's at roughly the same stage of construction as the other one was in January. So it may still be a while before it's ready to be transported and installed at LC-39A. Since our last flyover, SpaceX teams have also started building additional Starship Tower assembly locations at Roberts Road. In fact, there are 2 tower columns already being staged at this site. NSF first reported these additional assembly locations back in May in a Starbase update. That was thanks to pictures from our friend Anthony Iemole. At that time, we had also spotted the 4 pieces that connect the concrete base of the tower to the first steel module. While they were originally placed at the site of the old assembly locations, it seems like SpaceX moved them closer to the Hangar X2 facility for some reason. Now, it's not surprising to see new locations and tower hardware appearing at Roberts Road, since SpaceX may potentially be building an additional 5 towers in Florida. One of them would be for the proposed Catch Tower at Launch Complex 39A, while the other 4 would be for Space Launch Complex 37. There, SpaceX has plans for 2 launch towers and up to 2 catch towers. Each of the towers built so far has had 9 sections. 9 sections? Which means 9 of these locations were needed per tower. But there's evidence that the towers at Slick 37 may be taller than the current ones, so more assembly locations will definitely be needed. These other locations might mean SpaceX could have the ability to build multiple towers at the same time. That all probably means we're going to see lots of tower construction in the not too distant future. And as Jack would say, more towers, more better. If you've watched the last couple of flyovers, you might have wondered why we didn't talk about the ship quick disconnect arm that's sitting north of the Hangar X2 building. The reason for that is there really hasn't been any work that we've seen done on it for quite a while. It just looked abandoned. But that changed on this latest flyover. We can clearly see teams are working on it, and there are also pipes on the ground next to the QD arm. Remember that we first saw construction on this all the way back in 2022, 3 years ago. The design of the launch pad in 2022 was a whole lot different than the design that SpaceX is going for now in 2025. Based on the quick disconnect arm built for Starbase's second pad, the main framework and structure of the arm itself seems unchanged, but a lot of the internal hardware is being modified. So it wouldn't be surprising if SpaceX is finally getting around to updating it to the new design. That includes, for example, vacuum-jacketed cryogenic pipes, which are a lot more efficient than the ones that were put in during the original design. Before we move on from Roberts Road, I have to point out the amount of hardware being staged near the northeast corner of the Hangar X2 building. These are very conveniently located next to the Starship Heat Shield Bakery, located on the north side of Hangar X2. And no, they don't make cookies in that bakery, although that sounds delicious. That's one of the sites SpaceX uses to manufacture the heat shield tiles that Starship uses. Yup, even though no Starship vehicles have launched yet from Florida or even made it to the Space Coast, its heat shield is made right here. And now I'll hand it over to Adrian for the latest on KSC activity and how Blue is preparing for its next New Glenn launch. Adrian?
Thanks, Sawyer. Over at the KSC and Cape Canaveral Space Force Station expansions, we have been informed by Space Florida of a new sublease. This one has a rather mysterious name called Project Beep. The whole sublease was disclosed during a May 28 Space Florida Board of Directors teleconference agenda. The whole area was initially going to be used for a Firefly factory, but that no longer seems to be the case. It is part of Exploration Park, and with the company being a secret, there are of course several contenders, including Blue Origin itself, Amazon's Kuiper project, or other Cape activity companies such as Relativity, Stoke, and others. But who knows, maybe after all it's an entirely new company. The area is right in front of Blue's campus and next to the Airbus OneWeb facility, and will contain roughly 25 acres of land that will be developed by the unknown company. The whole lease will run for a total of 30 years initially, with more new options being negotiated down the line. So it's not somebody going for a short-term thing there either. Hopefully once actual construction starts there, we will get a better clue of what's going on there and what we can expect from the area. Let's put some focus on Blue Origin's facility at Exploration Park. This is of course the home of New Glenn and more, where Blue is gearing up for Flight 2 and beyond of the big rocket. One big progress versus our last flyover is the metal forming facility. If you look on the right side of this picture, you can see what appears to be frame and wall segments of the facility being erected in place. Of course, this is still very early in the construction process, but the build certainly has started. Another building we have been observing for quite some time now is the Lunar Plant 1. That is where Blue Origin will construct its Blue Moon landers and other lunar related infrastructure. The building looks much more complete from when we last flew, and it even gained the signature Blue Origin feather logo. Looks like it is being outfitted now, and with that, most likely very close to being operational. Right now, Blue is building 2 units of its Blue Moon Mark I lander, a cargo lunar lander the size of the Apollo lunar module that can carry up to 3 metric tons of cargo to the lunar surface. These builds are obviously not being done at this facility as it's not finished yet, so it's assumed they are being manufactured at the company's headquarters in Washington for the time being. Last month, Blue showed off hardware for the first Blue Moon Mk1 lander, in particular its mid-module. The company is gearing up for launch and preparing the hardware for that lander as we speak. Eventually, future Mark I landers will be built in Lunar Plant 1 facility, and the building will be rather useful when it's time to build the Mark II lander. That one will be a lot larger than the Mark I lander and is meant to be used under NASA's Artemis program to land humans on the lunar surface. So with it being so big, you have to build it close to its launch site. Not every time we peek inside of the TCAT and 2CAT we can be lucky. As you can see here, the 2CAT, the second stage cleaning and testing facility, is currently empty. So no stage 2 tank is in there right now. Of course, that does not mean that there is no second stage being in some flow right now in the campus, but at least we could not spot it in this particular building at the moment. In this storage yard, we can also see something quite interesting. It looks almost like some sort of construction of pressure vessels. Could this be testing for Blue Origin creating its own COPVs or other related inside of rocket pressure vessels? They will certainly need a lot between New Glenn and its lunar infrastructure. Another interesting thing we spotted is what looks like some sort of engine fit check unit. This is certainly not a real BE-4, but it could be used to fit check the engines on different prototypes and is currently stored inside of a yard, next to different bulkhead parts. It would be cool to see that part in action. Speaking of engines, Dave Limb, CEO of Blue Origin, posted quite a great picture of the full set of BE-4 engines needed for Flight 2 of New Glenn. In the first post he says, New Glenn's BE-4 shipset is ready for its second flight. A quick photo of our 7 engines on site at Rocket Park, and a spare. Our progress to launch continues. In the picture you can see the 8 beautiful BE-4 engines which are being stored somewhere at the exploration park. In a second tweet he says, here is another angle of our Rocket Park engine shop, and it's getting crowded in a good way. If you look closely, you also see some BE-3Us for future New Glenn missions. Our BE-3Us for New Glenn 2 were hot-fired in April and ready to go. So these BE-3Us are most likely for upcoming stages for Flight 3 and beyond. Blue Origin is starting to hit its pace, and let's hope we see these engines flying very soon. Speaking of flying engines, time to go over to LC-36 and look at the mighty New Glenn launch pad. Over at the pad, we can see LC-36 is being prepared for the installation of New Glenn 2. The next test we expect is either the core stage for Flight 2 or maybe even a test of the second stage for Flight 3 before the first stage moves in. Either way, it looks like activity is increasing over here. It will be interesting to see if other hardware shows up, like the booster forward module, given that was also tested separately for the Flight 1 campaign. After all, it's still a new rocket, so it wouldn't be so surprising to still see individual parts testing prior to launch. In another area, we can see how pipes are being prepared at the MKX test area. We suspect this area will be for cryo and other testing of the lunar landers, and the preparation of that area certainly will be a huge watch item in the next few months as Blue gears up for their first lunar missions. With the mid-module having arrived last month, maybe that will also be the first one to be tested at the new test site ahead of final integration and launch. While Blue Origin still aims for another launch or 2 of New Glenn this year, at this point with no core stage tested, it seems more and more likely that this will turn out to be just 1 extra launch at the maximum. But hey, maybe I'm totally pessimistic and wrong here. Over at Stoke Space Launch Complex 14, we can see that the construction of their integration hangar is going at a great pace with plenty of the building already above ground. The same goes for the tower at the launch pad. Stoke was so kind to post pictures of that recently, and you can see how the launch tower design certainly takes inspiration from other huge launch towers we have seen in the past. But I mean, it's in the end a launch tower. There's not that much to change there. Furthermore, we can see how the launch pad and tank farm are being constructed and more infrastructure is being placed ahead of the first launch of the company's Nova rocket. Certainly one of the most exciting rockets to fly soon. Look at this picture of the people standing in the flame trench of Nova. Certainly not a small rocket, and you can see parts of the wall segments already completely finished, while concrete on others is still in the frames as it hardens over time. It may not be a Starship or New Glenn, but Nova is still a mighty rocket. Over at Relativity Space, their huge Terran R hangar is going up as the company prepares to return to the Cape after its single launch so far, back then with Terran 1. It's rather easy to see the jump in size the company is making from the small Terran 1 to the bigger Terran R just by comparing the sizes of the hangars. Now, the much bigger Terran R is being prepared, which features many learning lessons from the previous rocket. Luckily, the company posts monthly updates to its YouTube account, where we can see that the launch site is making good progress as well, with foundation and construction work constantly ongoing. In a recent X post, the company said, "Our launch pad is rising at Cape Canaveral's LC-16, where Terran R's future flights will lift off. Construction is progressing across key areas, the horizontal integration facility is underway, foundation work for the water tower is in progress, and the east flume wall of the diverter pit is now complete." Both Stoke and Relativity are aiming for the first launch of their Nova and Terran R rockets in the next year or so it will be interesting to see whether they meet those schedules or not. Do you think we'll see that happen? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's hear from Ryan to talk about all the activity at SpaceX's own launch pads and marine assets.
Just as SpaceX was quite busy at Roberts Road, the same could be said for Launch Complex 39A. Here, teams have worked almost continuously every day. Even interruptions caused by Falcon 9 launches from the pad have been kept to a minimum, with cranes at the site observed in operation just a few hours after a launch. At Launch Complex 39A, there are at least two significant areas of interest concerning Starship: the Starship launch pad itself and the propellant tank farm being built to the north. At the Starship launch pad, teams have been persistently excavating the flame trench, which will direct the force of Super Heavy's 33 Raptor engines. Over the past several weeks, we have observed from our Space Coast Live cameras that concrete pumps have been delivering concrete to what seems to be various locations around the launch tower base, likely for the flame trench itself. It appears that SpaceX is constructing this one in a manner very similar to the one at Starbase's second launch pad. This involved adding piles to the base of the flame trench to establish a foundation for it. This was then followed by the placement of considerable amounts of rebar and concrete to form the floor and the walls of the trench. It seems that this is the stage at which the 39 flame trench currently stands. Some of the subsequent steps include the installation of the flame trench walls. These consist of two thick steel plates with a gap between them where concrete is poured to create a large and robust wall that safeguards the sides of the trench. In the past week or so, we have observed some of these wall sections being transported along the Saturn Causeway and heading towards Launch Complex 39A, so they may soon be added to the trench. For comparison, we saw these wall sections arrive at Starbase's second launch pad in mid-March. In fact, yours truly presented that Starbase update episode. This places the 39A flame trench approximately 4 months behind the one at Starbase. However, unlike at Starbase, we are yet to see construction of the service structure for this launch mount. This service structure connects to the launch mount and supplies it with many of the resources required for its operation. It also houses the two booster quick disconnect umbilicals. It is an extremely complex structure that at Starbase has likely required as much effort as the launch mount itself, yet there is none of that at Launch Complex 39A. Since it is difficult to legally fly directly over the launch sites at the Space Coast, our friend Harry Stranger has been regularly obtaining high-resolution images of Launch Complex 39A. In this satellite image from May, we can see that, although the structure is not yet under construction, SpaceX has installed concrete piles for its foundation. This indicates that the ground will be prepared to support the construction whenever it comes. From both the satellite image and our flyover views, we can observe considerable activity to the north of the complex. This is what we anticipate to be the propellant tank farm. At present, it is difficult to determine the configuration of that tank farm. However, since our last flyover, new tanks have been delivered to the site, so it may not be long before we discern its layout. We can also see additional new tanks to the west of the launch tower, which we presume are for the water deluge tank farm, much like the second launch pad at Starbase. It is evident from the work occurring at Launch Complex 39A that various components of the launch pad are progressing at different rates, making a comprehensive comparison to the second Starbase pad challenging. The flame trench may be 4 months behind, the launch mount may be 5 months behind, and so forth, but the overall progress of everything combined may actually be significantly further behind, so do not be surprised if things still appear quite incomplete by the end of the year. Before proceeding to the Falcon activities, we must shift our attention to Space Launch Complex 37, as there is further Starship news to discuss. Just last month, the Department of the Air Force published the draft environmental impact statement for Starship launches from Space Launch Complex 37, which contained a wealth of previously unknown details. For instance, SpaceX intends to construct 2 Starship launch towers at the site and may also install up to 2 catch towers, which could additionally serve as test stands. The site will feature its own air separation unit, a methane liquefaction plant, and much more besides. The document also confirms that SpaceX will transport Super Heavy boosters and Starship spacecraft by barge from Starbase to the Cape for the initial years, at least until full production is operational in Florida. While the environmental paperwork process is still ongoing, SpaceX received a limited right of entry in March that allowed the company to start some preparation work at the site. Last month, SpaceX demolished the existing mobile service tower and fixed umbilical tower that was used by ULA on the Delta IV family of rockets. During our team's flyover of the Space Coast, they were able to spot the cleanup work following that demolition last month. As we can see, it's well underway, and we'll definitely keep an eye on this launch pad's progress very closely. Eventually, SpaceX plans for up to 76 Starship launches per year from this site, while it also is asking for a cadence of up to 44 Starship launches per year from Launch Complex 39A. Max often refers to this as the spaceport that never sleeps, and that is already evident with the 1 AM Falcon 9 launches. However, with more than 100 Starship launches planned annually from the Space Coast, there will be even more activity to keep us awake. During our team's flyover of the Space Coast, it was a rather rare day at Port Canaveral, as every rocket recovery asset was there. Sort of. SpaceX's 2 fairing recovery vessels, Bob and Doug, were at the dock, with Doug still holding the fairing haft from the Starlink Group 10-28 mission. Just Read the Instructions was also berthed at its dock and awaiting its next assignment, which was the Deror 1 mission launched a few days later. But the real treat of the flyover was the arrival of a shortfall of Gravitas and Falcon 9 booster B1077 on top, having also supported the Starlink 1028 mission. Julia also managed to sneak in an extra special booster selfie. Normally, all of these vessels are out at sea, busy supporting missions, but with the lull of launches around the July 4th holiday, this was the exception to that rule. Also at port were Blue Origin's Jacqueline drone ship and support ship Harvey Stone. We've seen periodically over the last few months that recovery teams have been conducting sea trials offshore. This practice is likely to prepare for New Glenn's second launch, which may have a greater likelihood of successfully landing on the deck of Jacqueline compared to the first attempt. Alongside the activity we've already discussed, United Launch Alliance is gearing up for Vulcan's first launch for the US Space Force. The rocket is currently being stacked inside the Vertical Integration Facility, or VIF, at Space Launch Complex 41 for the USSF 106 mission. This flight will be the first launch of a Vulcan rocket with 4 GEM 63XL solid rocket motors instead of 2. It will also mark the commencement of launches for the military, having been certified for those missions earlier this year. The company is also diligently preparing a second vertical integration facility referred to as VIF-A, which will be utilized for Vulcan launches of Amazon's Kuiper satellites. In fact, the reason it is named VIF-A is because it will be used for Amazon missions. Once VIF-A is operational, the original vertical integration facility will instead be known as VIF-G, with the G standing for government, as that facility will be dedicated to supporting government missions. Speaking of government missions, during this flyover we also saw a lot more progress on Mobile Launcher 2 for NASA's Space Launch System. In recent months, contractor Bechtel, alongside teams from the Exploration Ground Systems, have stacked the remaining modules that form the large umbilical tower. With the tower structure now complete, it is being equipped with all the essential connections and components required to operate the SLS Block 1B rocket once it is positioned on the mobile launcher. Teams have already attached 2 of the swing arms to the tower, one being the core stage intertank umbilical and the other being the core stage forward skirt umbilical. While this work continues at the East Park site, which is north of NASA's Vehicle Assembly Building, inside the building itself is the SLS rocket for Artemis II, the first human spaceflight to the moon since the 1970s. Inside the VAB, teams have completed stacking of the SLS rocket, with the only element remaining being the Orion spacecraft, where the crew of Artemis II will be living for the duration of the mission. The spacecraft is currently undergoing servicing at the Multi-Payload Processing Facility, and sometime over the next month or two, it should depart the site to receive its launch abort system. Hopefully, if all goes well, Orion will be mated with SLS in the autumn. NASA is aiming to roll the rocket and spacecraft to the pad before the end of the year, with the goal of launching Artemis II no earlier than February 2026. That, of course, will depend on how well these next few steps go.
I know a lot has happened here on the Space Coast since our last flyover, so thank you for sticking with us, but I'm wondering, what launches do you guys think we'll still see before the end of the year? Will we see Starship hardware? Will we see 1, 2, 3 new Glenn flights? Let us know in the comments down below. I'm Sawyer Rosenstein for NSF, and as always, thanks for watching.